Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. This is another weekly update, and this week I want to show you what questions you need to ask the most senior doctor in intensive care if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. If your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, it certainly has its unique challenges and characteristics, and it's most likely that your and your family's life has been turned upside down in an instant or overnight, let alone the life of your critically ill loved one, who is most likely facing a crisis situation in intensive care. Those situations where your loved one is critically ill in intensive care tend to be nothing short of a once-in-a-lifetime situation and challenge, and it's so important that you know what to do in that situation where your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. It's of course very important that you and your family feel safe and well looked after in those challenging situations. And in all truth, nothing could be more challenging to feel safe, secure, in control, powerful and influential if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. If anything, you and your family feel challenged, vulnerable, and you are most likely struggling with fears and frustrations that are beyond your control. But how do you get to that all-important feeling of security, safety, control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? How will you get what you want during this critical, frustrating and challenging time? Well, one solution to the problem is certainly to know what questions you need to ask. And more importantly, you need to know which questions you need to ask to the intensive care team so that you have power, control and influence, because you certainly don't want to be at the mercy of the intensive care team. You see, the unfortunate reality is that most families of critically ill patients in intensive care do not know what questions to ask, and they are so paralyzed by their fears and frustrations that they don't know what to do, so that they are blindly following the intensive care team without actually knowing that the intensive care team has its own agenda, and that the intensive care team is often guided by the moving parts in the background, by the politics and by other competing forces within the high-stress environment that is intensive care. And those moving parts and competing forces in an intensive care unit and the things that are happening in the background of an intensive care unit often determine: number one, the way your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis is sold to you and your family. Number two, the way the intensive care team positions your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis. Number three, the care your critically ill loved one is receiving or not receiving. Number four, the treatment your critically ill loved one is receiving or not receiving. Again, the sad reality is that most families of critically ill patients simply don't know the things that are happening in the background of an intensive care unit, and they simply don't ask the right questions, because knowing about the right questions and then actually asking them will give you the right answers, and it will give you power, influence and control. One of the challenges in intensive care is that doctors appear to be notoriously time poor, to the point where they often avoid talking to family members of critically ill patients, and they often delegate those difficult conversations to their junior colleagues or sometimes to the nursing staff. But in order to get to the meat of it all, you need to make sure that you speak to the most senior doctor and get answers from the horse's mouth, so to speak. The most senior doctor in intensive care is most often also one of the key decision makers who, together with the nurse manager, allocates precious and often scarce resources in the intensive care unit, and they most likely know about other competing forces. Therefore, you need to take a sniper approach towards the most senior doctor in intensive care, and you need to ask succinct, and targeted questions that will give you all the right answers and that will give you the insight you need so that you can then position yourself correctly in order to have the maximum power, influence and control. Only then will you be able to be in a good position to negotiate the best possible care and the best possible treatment for your critically ill loved one. So in order to not hold back on the 6 most important questions you need to ask the most senior doctor in intensive care that will ultimately leverage your level of control, power and influence, here are some of the most important questions. Number 1. How does the intensive care unit's budget impact on my critically ill loved one's stay in intensive care? Number 2. How do you know, or how do you expect to know, how my critically ill loved one's quality of life is going to be after their stay in intensive care? Number 3. How does other patients awaiting admission to intensive care impact on my critically ill loved one's prognosis? The good news is that I have created a free report for you that you can download now when you enter your email below. In this free report, you will discover the 6 questions you need to ask the most senior doctor in intensive care. This free 23-page report gives you not only the 6 most important questions that you must ask the most senior doctor in intensive care, and those questions also leverage your level of power, control and influence that other families of critically ill patients in intensive care don't have. If you enter your email below, you will also make an instant impact on the intensive care team, because you learn very quickly how to speak the secret intensive care language so that doctors and nurses in intensive care know straight away that you are an insider and that you know, and your free report, the 6 questions you need to ask the most senior doctor in intensive care, and your free instant impact report make you understand what's really happening in intensive care. Armed with that knowledge, you will have massive control, power and influence, and you won't suffer fools lightly. With those reports, you will get immediate control, power and influence. And if you download your free instant impact report and your free the 6 questions you need to ask the most senior doctor in intensive care now by entering your email below. In those free reports, you learn immediately how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the nurses and the doctors know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In those free reports, you'll also discover how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to control, power and influence in your situation. You will get crucial behind the scenes insights so that you understand what's really happening in intensive care. You learn how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. With your free instant impact report and with the 6 questions you need to ask the most senior doctor in intensive care, you will get 3 other free reports. You'll get 10 things you didn't know doctors and nurses are talking about while you are not at the bedside with your loved one. The 7 answers to the 7 most frequently asked questions if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. And 9 myths of being a critically ill patient in intensive care. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week with another update.